The wind in Montana always carried a kind of loneliness. It whistled across the endless plains, rattled the old fences, and swept through the quiet towns that seemed to be holding on by a thread. For Daniel Cotta, it was the kind of sound that sank straight into the bones, a reminder of how empty life had become. Daniel was only in his mid-30s, but the years had carved lines into his face as if he had lived a lifetime longer. The war had taken much from him: brothers in arms, people he trusted more than family, and the sense of belonging that once kept him steady. When he came back, the world didn't feel like home anymore. Crowds unsettled him. Small talk felt pointless. Nights were the worst. The silence left too much space for memories he wished he could forget. So he drifted, one town to the next, sleeping in motels, working odd jobs, keeping his duffel bag always ready to move. He told himself he was searching for peace, but in truth, he was only running from the ghosts of war and from the man he feared he had become. It was a bitter cold winter afternoon when he found himself in a small county office on the edge of a quiet Montana town. His boots tracked in slush, and his army surplus jacket smelled faintly of wood smoke. Daniel wasn't supposed to be there for long, just another stop on a road with no destination. But then he overheard two clerks talking. "A house no one wants," one said, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Forgotten for decades, costs more to tear it down than it's worth. They'll sign it away for $1 if anyone's foolish enough." Daniel paused. His hand tightened around the strap of his bag. "A house. For a single $1. The clerk noticed him listening. "You interested, stranger? It's just trouble. No heating. Roofs collapsing. Folks call it the forgotten house. Been rotting away at the edge of town for 30 years. You'd be better off sleeping in your truck." But Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Something in his chest stirred, a quiet pull he couldn't explain. For years he had been drifting through places that never meant anything to him. A house like this, even broken, even unwanted, it could be different. Not just a place to stay, but maybe a chance to start over. The paperwork took less than 15 minutes. A signature, a handshake, a single dollar bill slid across the counter. That was it, for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Daniel Carter had bought a house. When he arrived at the property, the sun was beginning to sink, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. The house stood alone at the far edge of town, its silhouette jagged against the horizon. It looked less like a home and more like a relic left behind by time. Roof tiles were missing, like teeth knocked out in a fight. The windows were cracked, some broken entirely, jagged shards still clinging stubbornly to the frame. Ivy and moss crawled up the sides of the building, swallowing it inch by inch. The wooden porch sagged under his boots as he stepped up, groaning, as though it might collapse under his weight. Inside, the air was heavy with dust. Every step he took made the old floorboards cry out in protest, the sound echoing through the hollow rooms. The last light of day cut through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating swirls of dust that danced like tiny ghosts in the air. Daniel stood there in the middle of the ruined living room. To anyone else, it was worthless, a pile of rotting wood destined to be torn down. But to him, it was something else entirely. For the first time in years, he felt still. He wasn't on the road. He wasn't in some nameless motel. He was standing in a place that could be his. He dragged a calloused hand slowly across the peeling wallpaper, the brittle flakes crumbling under his touch. His voice came out low, almost as if he were afraid to break the silence. "Maybe this is where I start over." The words hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, echoing back to him like a promise. Outside, the wind howled across the Montana plains, but inside, Daniel Carter, former soldier, wanderer, broken man, stood in a forgotten house with a $1 deed in his pocket. And though he didn't know it yet, this crumbling ruin would be the place where his story began again. Not just a story of survival, not just a story of healing, but a story of family, one he never thought he'd find. The first night in the forgotten house was colder than Daniel expected. The walls, thin and broken, did little to keep out the Montana wind. He had dragged his old army sleeping bag into what was once the living room, spreading it across the floorboards that groaned beneath his weight. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from somewhere far off. He lay there, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening. Silence. But it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. No, this was the heavy silence of abandonment, the kind that pressed in from all sides, reminding him that this house had been empty for decades. Daniel had lived through nights far worse, nights in war zones where every creak of a branch could mean an ambush, nights where the distant thunder wasn't weather but artillery. He told himself this night was different. Safe, he was home now, or something close to it, but just as his eyelids grew heavy it came. A sound, faint, almost too soft to notice. A low, broken whimper. Daniel froze. His soldier's instincts returned in an instant. Muscles tense. Senses shocked. He sat up slowly, breath held, his ears straining. For a moment, he wondered if it was memory playing tricks again. He had heard phantom sounds before, echoes of the battlefield that came back to haunt him in the dark, but then it came again, clearer this time. A sound of pain, of desperation, a whine. Daniel reached for the flashlight beside his sleeping bag. Its beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and shadows that seemed to shift as the light moved. The sound was coming from below. The basement. He hadn't even opened the basement door earlier when he explored the house. The air upstairs had already been heavy with dust. He couldn't imagine what the cellar would smell like. Damp, mold, years of neglect. Still, his boots found the floor. The soldier in him moved on instinct. Investigate, confirm. The stairs groaned under his weight as he descended. The air grew colder, heavier. The beam of light danced over cracked stone walls and rusted shelves stacked with forgotten jars. And then his heart caught. In the far corner, curled against the wall, was a shape, a dog. Not just any dog, a German shepherd. Her fur was matted and dirty, patches missing where wounds had once been. Her ribs showed through her thin frame, and her breathing was shallow, ragged. But it wasn't just her condition that struck Daniel. It was her eyes, wide, desperate, yet still holding a glimmer of something he knew all too well, the will to survive. She tried to stand when the flashlight hit her, but her legs trembled and gave out. A whimper escaped her throat, not of aggression but of plea, and then Daniel noticed. Her belly swollen, heavy. She was carrying life. Daniel's jaw tightened. His mind spun. A wounded dog, pregnant, alone in a basement that hadn't seen a human in decades. What were the odds? He crouched low, careful not to startle her. His flashlight aimed at the ground now. His voice, usually rough and clipped, softened. Easy, girl, easy. Her ears flicked, though her body stayed pressed against the wall. The whimper turned into silence, but her chest still heaved, each breath a struggle. Daniel felt something stir inside him, something buried under years of numbness. He remembered battlefields, where men clung to life in the dirt, eyes wide with the same silent plea, "Don't leave me here." The German shepherd's gaze was no different. For a long moment, Daniel just knelt there, the cold seeping into his knees, his thoughts fighting. He had nothing to give, no furniture, no supplies, barely enough food for himself. He had bought a house for $1 because it was all he could afford, taking in a half-dead pregnant dog. It was madness. And yet, turning his back, walking away, that was impossible. Because Daniel Carter was still a soldier, and soldiers don't abandon the wounded. Slowly, he set the flashlight on the floor and reached into his duffel. A crumpled piece of jerky was all he had left from the road. He tore it in half, placing a piece gently on the floor between them. The dog sniffed, hesitant. Then, with trembling effort, she crawled forward, inch by inch, until her teeth closed weakly around the food. Daniel let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "There you go. You're not alone anymore." For the first time in years. Those words weren't just for her. They were for him too, in that cold, forgotten basement, surrounded by dust and silence. Something fragile yet unbreakable formed between a broken man and a broken animal, a thread of trust, a promise. Daniel didn't know how he would keep it. He didn't know if she would even survive the night. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not let her die alone. And as he gathered her gently into his arms, carrying her up the creaking stairs, the forgotten house seemed to breathe differently. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting for a new story to begin. Daniel carried the shepherd into the living room of the abandoned house. The dog's body was weak, its breathing uneven, but he held her carefully, like something fragile that might break at any moment. The living room wasn't much better than the basement, but at least it wasn't damp. The air was cold, still, and full of dust. Broken furniture leaned against the walls. A cracked window let in a faint gray light from the outside. He set her down on an old rug in the corner. She curled up instantly, cautious, her ribs showing with every breath. Daniel crouched nearby, resting on one knee, watching her. The silence in the room was heavy. For a moment, he just stayed there, breathing with her, letting the reality sink in. His backpack held almost nothing: a few strips of dried meat, half a bottle of water, and a small roll of bandages he had carried since the service. Not much, but enough to try. He pulled the bandages out and unscrewed the cap of the water bottle. As he poured a little water onto the wound on her side, the dog whimpered. Her muscles tensed. Daniel paused, whispering under his breath, "It's all right. Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." The words weren't really for her, they were for himself. His hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of memory. This wasn't the first time he had pressed cloth to an open wound. The smell of dust and blood took him back to another place. Sand, smoke, and the sound of men groaning on the battlefield. He blinked hard, forcing the past away. This was different. This was here. This was now. Bit by bit, he cleaned the wound and wrapped it. His work was clumsy, but it was enough to stop the bleeding. When he finished, the shepherd let out a long sigh and settled her head on the rug. Daniel sat back, exhausted from the effort. It felt like I had just gone through a mission. He reached into his pack again, pulled out the last of his dried meat, and broke it into small pieces. He placed one piece near her muzzle. At first, she only sniffed. Her eyes were sharp, wary, searching his face as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally, she licked the piece once, then took it into her mouth. Slowly, carefully, she chewed. Daniel felt something shift inside him. That small act, a wounded dog taking food from his hand, was bigger than it looked. It was trust, fragile and uncertain, but real. He leaned back against the cold wall, stretching his tired legs. His own stomach ached with hunger. He hadn't eaten in nearly a day, but giving the food to her, it felt right. He watched her chew, then close her eyes, resting her head again. The room was silent except for the sound of their breathing. Dust floated in the weak light from the broken window. Daniel stared at it, letting his thoughts wander. Since leaving the war he had been drifting, one town to the next, sleeping wherever he could, trying to find something that felt like home, though nothing ever did. He had told himself this house was only a stop, just another night in the cold. But now, with this animal lying in front of him, bleeding, vulnerable, and pregnant, he felt something different. Responsibility. He remembered the look in her eyes when he first found her in the basement, the same look he had seen in soldiers who thought no one would come for them, that hollow, desperate hope. He knew that look too well to ignore it. He whispered again, this time softer, "You're not down there anymore. You're safe now, as safe as I can make it." The shepherd didn't respond, but she opened her eyes for a second, glanced at him, then shut them again. To anyone else it might mean nothing, but to Daniel, it was enough. He stayed awake for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall. Every so often, she twitched in her sleep, and he would shift closer, making sure she was still breathing. He wasn't sure why he cared so much, but he did. Maybe because in saving her, he felt like he was saving a part of himself too, the part that still believed in keeping someone alive, no matter the odds. House around them was crumbling. The wind pushed through the cracks in the boards, carrying the cold. Daniel pulled his old jacket tighter around him. He thought about the coming days. She was pregnant. That meant more lives, fragile ones, depending not just on her, but on him. He had no plan, no resources, yet deep down, he knew he wouldn't walk away. He lay down on the floor across from her, using his pack as a pillow. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a bridge had been built. The silence no longer felt empty, it felt shared. Before closing his eyes, he said one last thing, more to himself than to her, "You're not alone anymore." And for the first time in months, maybe years, Daniel didn't feel completely alone either. The storm came fast. Clouds rolled over Montana like a dark tide, swallowing the last light of day. By the time night fell, the wind was tearing through the broken windows of the old house, rattling loose boards and whistling through every crack. Rain hammered the roof in sharp bursts, seeping through the gaps and dripping onto the dusty floor. Daniel had seen storms before on battlefields, under skies that promised nothing but chaos. But this one felt different. The old house groaned, with every gust, testing him, daring him to leave. He moved what little he owned out of the path of the leaks, set out bowls to catch the dripping water, then turned back toward the living room. Because that's where the real fight was about to begin. The German shepherd still nameless, though he was beginning to feel she deserved one, lay restless, near the cold hearth. Her belly shifted, tightening, then loosening. Her breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes darted to him with a mix of fear and something else. Expectation, instinct told him what was happening. She was going into labor. Daniel froze. For a moment, panic surged. He had no medical training for animals, no real supplies, just rags, a flashlight, and his hands. He forced the fear down. He remembered what an old medic once told him in the war. When you don't know what to do, stay calm, keep them breathing, don't leave their side. That, he could do. He dragged an old blanket from his pack, laid it down beside her, and knelt close. The storm raged outside, wind howling through the broken windows, but he spoke over it in a low voice. "You're not alone in this. I'm right here. Do you hear me? Right here." Her breathing quickened. The minutes stretched like hours. She whimpered, shifting, pressing against the blanket as her body strained. Daniel wiped his forehead. Though the room was cold, he held the flashlight steady on the floor beside her. His hands built for rifles, and survival hovered uncertainly, ready but unsure. Then it happened. A tremor, a muffled cry, and suddenly, a tiny, fragile life slipped into the world. Daniel's chest clenched. The pup was small, slick, barely moving. For a split second he thought it wouldn't make it. Then training he didn't know he had kicked in. He grabbed a rag, cleared its nose and mouth, rubbed its tiny body. For an agonizing second, silence. Then a squeak, thin, weak, but alive. The sound cut through the storm like a beacon. He placed the pup near its mother, and the shepherd, trembling but determined, began to lick it clean. Relief hit Daniel like fire. One had made it, and then another came, and another. Each birth was a battle. She strained, whimpered, pushed, and Daniel was right there steadying her, whispering, cleaning each fragile body as it arrived. His hands shook, not from fear, but from something else, something he hadn't felt in years. By the time the storm outside reached its peak, 5 tiny bodies wriggled on the blanket. Their cries filled the room, high and thin, blending with the thunder and rain. The shepherd lay panting, exhausted but alive. Her pups pressed close against her, searching for warmth. Daniel sat back, drained. His clothes were damp with sweat, his hands stained with blood and birth. But his eyes never left her. For the first time in years, he smiled. A real one. Tired, broken, but real. "You did it, girl," he whispered. "You brought them through." Her eyes met his. Something passed between them. Not words, but weight, trust, gratitude, maybe even love. He felt it in his chest, deep and solid. Lightning flashed through the broken window, lighting up the ruined walls. In that brief burst, Daniel didn't just see an old house falling apart. He saw something else. A beginning. He looked at the pups, then back at her. His voice dropped to almost nothing. 5 new lives, and you, guess I've got myself a family now. The word lingered on his tongue. Family. It felt strange, foreign. He had lost one family, to the war. But here, in a ruined wanderer house, fate had given him another. As dawn broke, the storm began to fade. The rain slowed. The thunder rolled into silence. The air was cold and damp, but peaceful. Daniel pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, leaned close to the shepherd, and ran a hand along her head. "You're safe now," he murmured. "All of you, I swear it." He didn't know how he'd keep that promise. He didn't know how to feed them, or fix the house, or build a life from the ruins. But for the first time in years, he wanted to try, because the storm hadn't just delivered new life. It had delivered something Daniel Carter thought he'd lost forever. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Rain-slicked roads glimmered in the early light, and the heavy clouds of the night had parted to reveal the pale, tentative sun of a Montana morning. Daniel stirred slowly on the warm cot. He had dragged into the living room, muscles aching from the long, sleepless nights spent beside the German shepherd and her newborn pups. His face was still streaked with sweat and a little blood, and his calloused hands bore the marks of a night spent wrestling with life itself. He sat up, listening. The soft whimpers of the pups mixed with the quiet, rhythmic panting of their mother. The house, once filled with only silence and the occasional creak of old boards, now hummed with life. Tiny paws scuffled over the blanket, each sound a heartbeat of possibility. Daniel breathed in deeply, smelling the damp wood, the wet earth seeping through the cracks in the floor, and the unmistakable, warm scent of new life. A smile tugged at his lips, more hesitant, but there nonetheless. "Morning," he whispered, though only the pups and their mother could hear. "You made it." Feeding them would be the first challenge. He had no formula, no specialized supplies, only the remnants of dry kibble he had managed to scrape together during a trip to the local general store yesterday. He warmed water in an old pot over the rusted stovetop, cradled the smallest of the pups in his hands, and coaxed it to lap at the meager meal. Each swallow was a victory, each squirm a reminder that they depended on him entirely. The German shepherd watched quietly, her amber eyes luminous in the morning light. She sniffed the air cautiously, then nudged Daniel gently with her nose, as if to say, "I trust you. Don't let them starve." Daniel's throat tightened. He knelt, running a hand along her side. "I won't," he murmured. "Not you, not them, not ever." Breakfast for himself came later, or rather, it didn't. There wasn't time, not yet. He moved from pup to pup, ensuring each was warm, dry, and fed. The smallest one shivered in his hands, its tiny body weaker than the others. He held it close, whispering encouragement as the others wrestled and yipped nearby. By mid-morning the storm had retreated completely, leaving silver puddles reflecting the pale sun. Daniel ventured outside with the German shepherd, holding the smallest pup against his chest. The wind was sharp against his face, carrying the scent of wet pine and the lingering damps of the storm. He scanned the horizon, the hills, the crumbling fences, the neglected fields stretching out in every direction, and realized, painfully, that survival would not come easily. House offered shelter, yes, but not comfort. The roof leaked, the floorboards groaned, and there was no running water. Food would have to be scavenged or bought. Repairs would have to be made. And the pup's innocent, fragile, demanding, needed constant care. Yet, as he looked down at the little lives cradled in his arms, Daniel felt a surge of determination he hadn't known he was capable of. He set down the smallest pup in a nest of blankets near the fireplace. The others tumbled over one another, yipping, licking their mother's fur, exploring the world with uncoordinated curiosity. Daniel watched them, noting the patterns of their tiny movements, the way the mother nudged and guided them, the way each small cry demanded attention. It was exhausting and exhilarating. He needed a plan. First, water. He checked the old kitchen, found a few rusty cans, and filled them from a bucket he had left outside to catch rainwater. He cleaned the bowls, as best he could, washing them in the chilly water and drying them with an old rag. The German shepherd watched every motion, her eyes following his, sometimes tilting her head as if judging his competence. Food came next. Daniel remembered the stash of canned beans, dry kibble, and stale bread in the corner of the pantry. It was enough to sustain them for a few days, but not long. He made a mental list of what he'd need to survive. More importantly, what the pups would need: milk, warmth, safety. Every decision, every action from that moment on, had to consider the small lives depending on him. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden streaks across the broken floorboards, Daniel worked methodically. He patched leaks, as best he could, using scraps of cloth and bits of wood, creating little shelters within the larger shelter. The pups tumbled, explored, and occasionally barked at their reflections in puddles of water on the floor. And each time Daniel laughed softly, a sound he realized had been absent from his life for years. By noon, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, but he couldn't resonate while the mother lay beside her pups, keeping them warm, her head occasionally lifting to watch him with those patient, trusting eyes. He sat beside her, letting her warmth brush against him, and whispered, "We'll make it, somehow. We'll make it." Outside, the wind carried the cries of distant crows, and the hills seemed to stretch endlessly. But within the walls of the $1 house, Daniel felt the stirrings of life, hope, and purpose. The world was still harsh, still unpredictable, but for the first time he felt he had a reason to face it. As evening approached, Daniel gathered the pups in a makeshift bed near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and pine. He knelt beside the mother, stroking her ears gently. "You've done it," he said softly. "You've survived, and we'll survive together." For the first time in months, he allowed himself to believe that this house, once a forgotten relic, could be something more: a home, a sanctuary, a place where broken lives, theirs, could be stitched together. He glanced around at the battered walls, the peeling paint, and the sagging ceiling, and felt a strange pride. Every scar on the house mirrored a scar in himself, and together they could heal. That night, as darkness fell, the storm of the previous night only a memory, Daniel sat beside the fire, the German shepherd curled at his feet. The pups nestled close to her. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he let himself feel the warmth of this new family, the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that, despite the wreckage, life had persisted and thrived. He whispered to no one in particular, "We'll get through this, one day at a time, together." And for the first time, the silence of the forgotten $1 house felt like a promise instead of a burden. The days that followed were a blur of motion, noise, and the tiny, insistent demands of new life. Daniel Carter woke each morning to the soft yips of the puppies, their paws pattering across the worn wooden floors like a delicate drumbeat announcing the day. The German shepherd, strong now, though still cautious with each movement, watched over them, shifting occasionally to allow the little ones to nurse or nap. For Daniel, each morning was a battle against exhaustion. The storms of the previous night had left leaks in the roof that needed constant patching. Cold drafts slipped through the broken windows, curling around his feet as he carried fresh blankets and food to the pups. Yet, in every act of care, he felt the old familiar sense of purpose, the feeling of being needed, of being responsible for lives that relied entirely on him. It was different from the battlefield, where orders were given and risks calculated. Here every decision carried the weight of survival, every touch held the promise of life. The house, too, began to transform under his hands. He scraped peeling paint, nailed loose boards, and cleared away the accumulated detritus of decades. Slowly, room by room, he could see the potential beneath the decay. The cracked walls seemed less oppressive when sunlight poured in through cleaned windows. The dusty floors no longer seemed hollow when the tiny claws of the puppies danced across them, leaving temporary tracks of life behind. Feeding the mother and her pups became a ritual. Daniel measured out dry kibble, softened it with warm water, and watched the pups stumble over one another to get to their mother's side. The German shepherd licked their heads, gently nudging them into order, while Daniel marveled at the synchronicity of the small family. Their trust was growing, not instantaneously, but through countless repeated gestures, a soft voice, a gentle hand, a warm blanket. One afternoon after the chores were completed, Daniel sat on the front porch, watching the wind sway the long grass of the neglected yard. The sun dipped low, casting long, golden shadows across the hills of upstate New York. The German shepherd pedaled up beside him, resting her head on his thigh, and he could feel her warmth seep into him. The pups tumbled behind her, chasing one another, occasionally darting into the house when a strange noise frightened them. Daniel's thoughts drifted. He had been alone for so long, years of wandering had made him self-sufficient but also lonely in a way that the barracks and battlefields had never allowed him to feel. Every brother lost, every friend fallen, had left a scar, and returning home had revealed an emptiness that nothing could fill. But now, in this crumbling $1 house, life had returned to him. He leaned back in the old rocking chair he had repaired, feeling the wood creak beneath him. "We're making it," he whispered, almost to himself. "We're a family now." The German shepherd lifted her head, as if acknowledging his words. In her eyes, he saw understanding and intelligence, a loyalty, a bond that transcended species. As the weeks turned into a month, Daniel's routine became almost sacred. Every morning he checked on the pups first, ensuring they were warm and fed. He cleaned the blankets, refilled the water bowls, and prepared breakfast for himself, often eating while observing the tiny chaos around him. Each pup grew at its own pace, learning to walk steadily, bark, and explore the small yard. Each milestone brought with it a quiet triumph, and Daniel celebrated them as if he had witnessed victories on the battlefield. The house itself had begun to show signs of life. The living room, once filled with shadows and dust, now held a small cluster of blankets and toys for the pups. A fire crackled nightly in the hearth, sending warmth through the rooms, driving away the lingering chill. The walls, still scarred and peeling, seemed to pulse with the energy of life inside them. One morning Daniel found himself laughing a deep, hearty laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. The pups had discovered an old sock, tugging and wrestling over it in the hallway. The German shepherd barked once, sharp but playful, before joining in the chase. Daniel clapped his hands, cheering them on, and realized in that moment that the house no longer felt empty. There were challenges, of course. One pup had a weak leg, and Daniel spent hours gently guiding it, coaxing it to stand, to step, to run. There were days when the wind howled, bringing a chill that seeped through the broken windows, and Daniel would huddle with the family around the hearth, holding each little body close. Every illness, every whimper, every small accident carried weight, but Daniel met each one with patience and care, understanding that survival was not a singular act, it was continuous. He also began to think about the future. The house needed repairs he could not do alone. Supplies would run out. Food had to be sourced regularly, but instead of despair, he felt resolve. This wasn't just about maintaining life. It was about creating it, and he could feel the bond forming, a silent promise between him and the creatures who depended on him. He would never abandon them, just as they trusted him implicitly. Evenings were the most poignant. Daniel would sit by the fire, his hands in the fur of the German shepherd, the pups nestled at her side, and he would allow himself to reflect. He remembered the war, the camaraderie, the loss, the endless march through dust and blood. Those memories still weighed heavily, but they were no longer the sole measure of his existence. Here he had life, love, and purpose. One particularly quiet evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink across the horizon, Daniel spoke aloud to the empty house, to the family before him, to the ghosts of the past. "We're together. That's all that matters now. We'll get through everything, one day at a time." The German shepherd rested her head against his knee, and the pups huddled closer, ears twitching, eyes half closed. He could feel their trust, their dependence, their gratitude, and he felt, in turn, a connection he had thought impossible for himself. Love. By the end of the month, Daniel had crafted a small routine: mornings for feeding and cleaning, afternoons for repairs, and evenings for rest and bonding. Each day, the house felt less like a relic and more like a home. Each night he drifted to sleep with the gentle weight of the German Shepherd curled against him. Pups snuggled at her side, listening to the soft breathing and quiet snores that marked life thriving, resilience, and hope. Daniel Carter, the soldier who had believed he had nothing left, now carried a family in his heart and in his hands. The $1 house, once forgotten and broken, had become a sanctuary. The walls might still sag, the roof might still leak, but the home was alive, not with money, not with possessions, but with loyalty, trust, and love. For the first time in years, Daniel felt whole, and he understood that a home, a real home, was not built from wood and nails alone. It was built from the bonds formed in the quiet struggles of life, from the protection of the vulnerable, and from the courage to care. As night fell, Daniel gazed at the soft glow of the fire and the tiny figures nestled around the hearth. He whispered softly, a vow to the family that had found him as much as he had found them. "We're together now, always, no matter what comes next." And, in that forgotten house at the edge of Montana, a new family had truly been born. The sun rose slowly over the hills, spilling warm light across the weathered shingles of Daniel's house. For the first time in years, the world felt quiet in a way that wasn't empty. The German Shepherd nudged his leg gently as he stepped onto the porch, her trust evident in the calm tilt of her head. The pups tumbled across the yard, chasing each other, slipping over tufts of grass, their tiny yips sharp against the morning air. Daniel smiled, not a small or hesitant smile, but one that reached deep, the kind that comes when you finally know you're home. Inside, the house was alive in a new way. It still bore its scars, the chipped paint, the uneven floorboards, the patched roof, but every floor now carried meaning. Each board Daniel had hammered, each nail he had set, was a testament not only to survival but to rebuilding. The rooms held warmth and laughter, not dust and silence. The smell of pine, mixed with the lingering scent of wet earth and the faint musk of the pubs, filled the air. It was the scent of life, of persistence, of a family forged in patience and care. Daniel crouched to stroke the mother dog's fur. Her eyes met his, steady and calm. She no longer flinched at sudden movements, no longer carried the fear that had shadowed her since before he found her. The pups scrambled over his legs, bumping into one another in their clumsy play, squealing with uncontainable energy. One pressed its tiny face against his cheek. Daniel laughed, the sound rough, warm, unguarded. It was a laugh he hadn't let himself have in years. He walked slowly across the yard, watching the pups explore. Each leap, each tumble, each bark told him something he already knew, but hadn't fully felt until now. Life was fragile, but it was worth fighting for. He stopped to pick up a small puddle of water, watching the reflection of the house ripple in its surface. The reflection wasn't perfect, just like the house itself, but it was enough to see possibility, enough to see home. Daniel thought about the road that had brought him here: long, empty streets, distant echoes of war, nights spent wandering through silence. All of it had led to this, a house bought for $1, now priceless in ways money could never measure. It wasn't the structure that mattered. It was the trust, the love, the bond between a man and those who depended on him. It was the first time he understood that family could be chosen, built, and nurtured, not just born into. As he walked back to the porch, the sun fully illuminating the yard, he saw the German Shepherd sitting tall, pups nestled against her. Daniel crouched beside them, letting the smallest crawl into his lap. The warmth of her body, the soft rhythm of her breathing, the trust in their eyes, he felt it like a pulse in his chest, a confirmation that all the efforts, the sleepless nights, the fear and doubt, had been worth it. He looked at the house again, letting the full weight of it sink in. It wasn't perfect, nothing about life was, but within these walls they had found safety, care, and a sense of belonging. The storm outside, both the literal one that had forced him to act and the storms of his own past, seemed far away now. Inside, there was peace. Inside, there was hope. Inside, there was home. Daniel stood slowly, brushing the grass from his hands. He whispered, almost to himself, "I thought I was buying a house from $1. What I really bought was everything that matters." The German Shepherd barked softly in reply. The pups yipped back, and it sounded like agreement. It sounded like family. He stepped inside one last time, letting the warmth of the fire brush his face. The pups tumbled around the hearth, their energy endless. The mother dog rested her head on his foot, and Daniel realized something profound. He had come to this house alone, scarred and hollow, carrying nothing but memories and wounds. Now, he was carrying more than memories. He was carrying life. He was carrying trust, love, and responsibility. And in doing so, he had found himself again. The $1 house, once forgotten and broken, had become a home in the truest sense. It had given him a family. It had given him purpose. It had given him courage to hope again. Daniel stepped out onto the porch as the sun climbed higher, breathing deeply the crisp pine-scented air around him. The hills of New York stretched wide and alive. The pups ran and tumbled. The mother watched with quiet vigilance, and Daniel felt a peace he had not known since long before the war. He smiled, fully, without reservation, whispering to the wind, the house, and the creatures that had changed his life. We're together now, always, no matter what comes next. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter truly believed it.